Greetings. In this video, I'm going to be looking at this particular question on liberalism and political ideas. I'm aware the microphone isn't particularly great in this video. It's the first one I've recorded this year, and I haven't had a chance to set up all the settings properly. So it's bassy, it's not great sound, but please just deal with it for this video. This particular question says, to what extent do modern and classic liberals agree over the nature of the state? You must use appropriate thinkers in your answer. So first of all, this is an essay that is entirely within liberalism, so we're not bringing in conservatism and socialism and to an extent any kind of other political examples from the kind of modern day in the UK or America or something like that, except if maybe there's a relevant example. And we're talking about the state, the nature of the state. This isn't one of those broader questions where you can bring in lots of different things. Everything has to be related to the state. If you are to bring in things like human nature and whatever, it always has to be tied back to this idea of the state. If you can't tie it to the state, it is not relevant and it would not gain you any marks or be credited. The next thing I want to talk about before we look at the kind of the answers is we need AO1, we need AO2, we need AO3. AO1, so we need knowledge of liberalism, we need knowledge of the thinkers, we need perhaps any kind of quotations, we need keywords, etc., etc. AO2, we need to kind of be talking about well, how these ideas relate to the state, we need to be making kind of chains of logical reasoning, we need to be kind of pushing one idea up against the other. And AO3, we also need an overall argument to the essay. It is not okay just to be kind of saying, here's where they agree and here's where they disagree. That gives you AO1 and that gives you AO2, but it doesn't give you AO3, because the AO3 is to what extent do modern and classic liberals agree. And you should have been told by your teacher that the exam board has said repeatedly over the last couple of years that they want students to be making a case. Therefore, the case needs to be, that there is huge amounts of agreement and only a tiny bit of disagreement. Or the other way around, there's loads and loads of disagreement and only one little agreement. Or maybe that they actually agree in all these different areas, but there is actually one big fundamental disagreement that overrides all the rest. Or the other way, you could be kind of saying, well, actually, broadly speaking, they are in line, but there are a couple of little areas where they disagree. But there needs to be, the AO3 needs to be pushing you just one side or the other. You are making the case. You are trying to persuade me that they either pretty much agree or they pretty much disagree. We don't want an essay where you kind of say, here are the agreement areas and here are the disagreement areas. That definitely goes into the essay, but that's AO1 and AO2. That is not AO3. AO3 is where you're making the case that there is more agreement or more disagreement, or fundamental agreements, fundamental disagreements, and so on. So that needs to be there in your essay. So, clearly I've done the animations the wrong way, so let's have a look at that one. So, what are the areas of agreement? Well, liberals broadly agree that the state's purpose is to protect and promote an individual's natural rights. And you can bring in all sorts of thinkers there. I was just kind of having a look at it before making this video, and loads of them talk about citizens' rights, whether it's Wollstonecraft talking about enshrining women's rights, or whether it's John Stuart Mill talking about protecting minority rights. Loads of them talk about rights. Even Locke at the very beginning talking about human beings in society being protected with natural laws and natural rights. They all agree that the state is there to protect rights. And you could even then go from this into the idea about whether the state is like a kind of a necessary evil, which is kind of an idea that kind of comes up with liberalism a lot, that they don't necessarily see the state as a good thing, but they see it as a necessary thing, although that might start to take you into areas of disagreement. They all agree that the state should embody government by consent. So they all believe that we should not have a monarchy, we should not have some sort of hereditary principle, we should not have a kind of a dictatorship. And that's a big agreement, because that's literally where kind of liberalism starts from, is this idea that people should be free, the government should be, of the people, by the people, for the people, all that kind of stuff. That there is a big push that there should be choice in government, and that the governed should only be governed by their consent and their kind of choice. And that's a big agreement. And that might even be your fundamental agreement about the state. You could make an argument that, yeah, they disagree about what the state does, the here and there, but actually fundamentally they all agree that whatever government we have, it should be by consent. I could see that being a pretty decent essay. They also all agree that this state should be constitutional in nature, which limits and disperses political power. And John Locke would be the obvious thinker here to use for both the constitutional bit and the government by consent bit. You've got a big. I need to stop saying the phrase I'll try. I'll try and stop saying but I won't. They all agree in a form of separation of powers. They believe that the powers of individual branches of government should kind of be laid out, which is why, to an extent, some people argue about to what extent is the UK a liberal democracy, because obviously we don't have a codified constitution, but we do have limited government and we do have the three kind of branches. But anyway, let's not get kind of sidetracked, but liberals agree that the state should be constitutional and limited. And these are some pretty important agreements. Where we start to get to the disagreements is about what exactly this limited state actually does. So you could see here that it is entirely possible to make an argument that liberals fundamentally agree, but they disagree about the details. That might be the way I would write this essay, but it is possible to go the other way. Let's look about the disagreement. So the disagreement comes in once you've kind of got this constitutional state that is there by consent and is protecting rights. It's to what extent does this idea of freedom and opportunity and equality kind of mix together. So let's have a look. They disagree about whether the state should embody the principle of negative liberty, which obviously comes from Mill, or positive liberty, reference rules and freedom. So here you could bring in the idea of freedom from or freedom to. You could bring in the idea of the veil of ignorance, which comes from Rawls. You could talk about the idea about how women are kind of stuck under a kind of a patriarchal kind of society. You could talk about this idea about whether the state is purely there to kind of free people as much as possible, or whether the state is there to enable people to fulfill their potentials. And that is a big disagreement about what the role of the state actually is. That's even going on into the modern day. New Labour very much saw themselves as enabling people to fulfill their potentials, whereas Cameron very much believed in kind of stripping back the state. He called it the big society, and the idea that people should, it was not government's role to be getting involved in these kind of things. Next bullet point. They disagree about whether the state should interfere more in society and the economy. Classic liberals, small governments. Ronald Reagan talking about, people ask me what government can do about the problem, and I say that the government is the problem. To what extent should the government be interfering in society and talking about social values and interfering in the economy, like Keynesian ethics and things like that, or to what extent should it be kind of stripped back? And here you are definitely taking your modern thinkers, Rawls and Frieden, and putting them against Mill, Wollstonecraft and John Locke. You want to find yourself some kind of quotations here or some ideas to kind of analyse. And lastly, they disagree about whether state taxation threatens liberty, in which case you could reference Mill, or enables liberty, in which case you would reference Rawls. There are other things that you could bring in, but these are the big ones, and these are the ones that the textbook suggested that you would bring in. Note here that the essay that we have put, that you could get out of this, is more than just negative liberty versus positive liberty. If your essay is only based around the idea, then you've only really got one point, which is why these ideas of agreement on rights, government by consent, constitutionality, this is where the other half of your essay comes from. Because remember, your essay does need to include agreement and disagreement. So if you were to write the essay and saying actually they fundamentally disagree, then what you would be arguing is that, yeah, they broadly agree that we should have a government which is by consent, but actually once that government exists, it is fundamentally different. One is as small as possible, with as little taxation, as little interference as possible, whereas the modern liberal version of the government is far bigger, far more sprawling, far more interfering, getting involved in society. That is also a valid route. But you need to pick one of those routes, because otherwise your essay will be too balanced, not really making a case, and your AO3 will be full. My personal one, as I said earlier, I think I'd probably go down that fundamentally they agree I think the states are very, very kind of familiar and similar to kind of one another, but they have perhaps, I think I would go down they fundamentally agree with some minor areas of disagreement. And the other reason I would do that is because I think there's actually more to say about the agreements. Like I think the bits where you talk about disagreements and in terms of negative liberty and positive liberty, they're really, really good, and it's a really good paragraph, maybe even 2 paragraphs, but I think you can bring more out of the agreement. However, that's advice rather than a suggestion. You could get full marks kind of going either way, as long as you've got enough quotations, ideas, key thinkers, examples to kind of bring in to illustrate your point. Structurally, there are lots of different ways to do this. You could go down the kind of areas of agreement and then the areas of disagreement. But to get kind of a good AO2, you do need to be kind of going between the classic liberal and the modern liberal kind of between the two. So what you definitely shouldn't do is just talk about classic liberalism and then modern liberalism, because if you do that, you're essentially kind of writing two kind of different essays really, and then somehow you've got to try and mold these together in a kind of another paragraph. So we want to be going between the different versions of classic and modern liberalism kind of constantly, or just kind of say, well, actually all liberals say this and other liberals agree with this as well. But even then you're still going between the different types, because they all agree that, to use the first bullet point, which is probably here somewhere, they all agree that you should have natural rights, so therefore you should be able to bring in a classic thinker and a modern thinker to kind of expand that idea. But you've got to be kind of tracing between the different ideas. So my personal structure would probably be to more or less go through the areas of agreement, pointing out all this kind of massive agreement, maybe kind of bring in small variations where I can to kind of show my high level understanding. Then I would have a big section about the kind of the positive liberty, negative liberty bit, and then I would probably then round off by kind of then saying, I'll probably round that section off by saying that even though there are differences here, we can still see that this state is very familiar and it's constitutional in nature. So I might even go bullet point 1 on agreement, bullet point 2 on agreement, bullet point 3 on disagreement with talking about negative liberty, positive liberty, interference, put that together, and then finish by going into my kind of constitutional section by saying that whatever this state is, it's limited, blah, 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 and then conclude by summarising the points I've made. I might have said that kind of too fast, but basically I might kind of go for my agreement, into my disagreement, and then finishing with a section on agreement I hadn't done, because it gives me a nice kind of thread and you thought, and you can see the kind of the logical chain of reasoning that I kind of made there. However, what did you come up with? Let me know, and good luck in your essays.